Hello, and thanks for joining me on this presentation about eco-anxiety and how we transform our anxiety into action. We're talking about making the most of vicarious climate trauma. My name is Anna Humphreys, and I will be guiding you through this presentation today. So this is a presentation about the psychological impacts of experiencing climate trauma from a distance. I'm going to establish a vocabulary for us, talk about some of the effects of these emotions on our lives and society, and I'll end by presenting some inspiration and resources. We all have to face the reality at some point. Climate change is real. It's happening. It's scary. And it's because of us. My own moment of reckoning came over the summer when I was really excited about having kids of my own. I was engaged to a wonderful man, still am today, but the conversation of having kids is off the table now because we realized that the future is very uncertain for our planet, for our children, and even for our own health as we age in a world that's facing serious destruction. There are levels of the impacts of climate change, and the levels take different psychological tolls. Direct and immediate impacts, like displacement or disaster, are what usually bring about PTSD and other pretty severe mental conditions. These psychosocial disruptions have visible and even violent effects on people and communities. These effects can include war. Indirect and vicarious trauma is what I'll be talking about today. And first, let me acknowledge that it's a privileged problem to have. If I'm experiencing vicarious trauma, it means that I haven't had it firsthand, which is unquestionably worse. Yet, according to the research I've done, it is an important topic to discuss. We in America have the opportunity and the responsibility to demand change from our policymakers. But the groundswell of movement that we desperately need isn't happening. A big part of this is because people who have the luxury to check out are not directly exposed to the worst effects of climate change. But even if we do look the problem in the face, we might not have the vocabulary to address it. I'm part of a growing trend of people freaking out about climate change. Over half of Americans polled in a 2018 survey by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication were concerned at least. 29% identified as alarmed. That was a big spike from the last poll that was taken. And over 70% of people across party lines acknowledge that climate change is indeed happening. People who acknowledge that global warming is happening constitute 73% of Americans, to be precise. That belief is often accompanied by emotions like disgust, helplessness, fear, and outrage. I was experiencing a lot of those emotions for myself, but I didn't really have a good term to describe what I was experiencing that just felt so enormous and all-encompassing. The word that seemed to fit best was environmental grief, so I looked it up for my own purposes, and I just found way too many terms for intense negative emotions about the existential threat of climate change. Here are a few I've come across in my own research. The one that I found most fitting, environmental grief, is patented. Other common terms are listed here: global dread, ecophobia, environmental melancholia, eco-paralysis, and solastalgia. This last one is a feeling akin to nostalgia or homelessness. It's when you've never left home and the place you used to get solace from has changed before your very eyes. This is common among victims of climate disasters, but it can also be experienced from afar. In fact, none of these emotions are limited to physical proximity. It's all about psychological closeness. If we care about something, it doesn't matter how far away it is. One of the blessings of modern media is that it can show us things that are happening very far away, and we can care deeply. One word that encompasses a lot of the emotions experienced from climate trauma is ecoanxiety, and it's the term that was developed and is being used by the American Psychological Association. It encompasses fear, anger, powerlessness, exhaustion, fatalism, solastalgia, a sense of loss, helplessness, hopelessness, and frustration because people don't feel like they can make a difference in stopping climate change. Symptoms of ecoanxiety can be similar to those of more direct climate trauma because the anxiety comes from the same neural and hormonal pathways as direct experience. Anxiety and other symptoms like panic attacks, irritability, loss of appetite, weakness, and insomnia can have negative impacts on our health, so it is a legitimate health concern. I didn't come across in any statistics about the prevalence of eco-anxiety, and this is because it's being considered a newer mental condition. Also, it's so tied up in other known mental conditions that it could be really hard to figure out that climate change is the culprit behind a person's anxiety or depression. We might misattribute it to other things that are really tied up with this existential dread. Since eco-anxiety is kind of new and not that well understood, we might not be talking about it, but not talking about it actually can lead to some pretty bad responses that aren't serving ourselves or anyone else. These responses can include numbness or denial, projecting responsibility onto others, thinking wishfully or magically about technological solutions or politicians that are going to come in and save us all and that we won't have to change anything. We might refuse to change because it's scary, it's big, and we're living the only way that we know how. We might get trapped in the uncertainty of knowing that climate change is bad, but not knowing how bad it's going to be, or not knowing what the good solutions are, so just figuring that we'll just keep going the way that we are and figure it out later. We might distract ourselves. We might give up. We might practice green consumerism, which is really a trap in itself, thinking that if we are buying green products, which, like that's a good thing to do, but it's not all that we need to be doing to face the existential threat that we're in today. All of this is really just us repressing our emotions about climate change and the disaster that we're facing. And a lot of this is because of this socially constructed silence, meaning that we feel uncomfortable bringing up topics that make other people uncomfortable. We don't want to be the Debbie Downers. We don't want to shame other people. And ultimately, being in with a social group is more important to some of us, to lots of us, than addressing the bigger things that are impacting us, but not in a way that we can see directly every day. But the consequences of our distraction and repression aren't just for ourselves. While Americans disengage and stay in our comfort zones, our government is doing serious damage. It's rolling back regulations to keep carbon emissions at bay, violating Indigenous treaty rights, and putting the wrong people into positions of power. And the consequences of inaction are being felt by the most vulnerable populations. Given the current administration, I don't know how much change citizens can really affect, but we won't know until we all try. A 2018 study on coping mechanisms for eco-anxiety found that emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt can motivate climate change action. Emotions can be guides and give us strength. They're not something to repress. They're something to pay attention to. A lot of activists and world changers get their motivation from the grief they experienced. Earlier, I was talking about maladaptive responses, but now I'm going to talk about the flip side of that, psychological adaptation. We adapt in a more positive way by acknowledging the problem is real, by developing positive coping strategies, and ultimately by changing our behavior and getting involved with efforts to address the problem. Adaptive responses include curiosity and concern, and skepticism about what we're hearing, really thinking about what we believe and what we know to be true, and investigating things. We can channel our grief into creativity. We can practice conservation and get involved in pro-social causes. And benefits of this adaptation for ourselves include being more frugal with our energy use, participating in social engagement, feeling a sense of competence and civic responsibility, and really feeling empowered with the tools that we have and the power that we have as citizens. And all of these are positive emotions. This is a way to counteract our grief and our anxiety and really channel it into something that feels good and that does good. This 16-year-old girl from Sweden is an extreme and wonderful example of transforming grief into action. When Greta Thunberg was 11, she became so depressed about climate change that she stopped eating and talking. With support from her parents, she has become one of the world's leading climate activists. She's spoken in front of the UNFCCC, given a TED Talk, and started a school climate strike movement that has catalyzed students and adults all around the world. But we don't all have to be Greta's. Even by acknowledging our emotions here today, we're already taking steps to address the climate crisis. But at least for me, it's nice to have examples and resources for what we can do. So these are some tips and tricks developed by the American Psychological Association in a 70-page report that they released about mental health and climate change. Building belief in your own resilience also includes showing yourself that resilience, fostering optimism, becoming a climate mental health literate professional, so us in the public health field or the social work field or really any medical field can understand how climate change is going to impact health and develop our practices accordingly. We can cultivate coping skills. This can include things like mindfulness and things that we do on a day-to-day basis that make us feel good, but also connecting with your family, your place, your culture, and your community, and being vocal about your feelings about climate change and how we need to redirect our efforts into positive action. The best antidote to feeling powerless is activism. It doesn't make you less sad, but it adds hope, solidarity, and love. The fellow who wrote this quote, Bill McKibben, started 350.org, which has chapters all over the US, including Seattle. The Seattle chapter of 350 looks like potluck dinners, art builds, legislative action, and some signs and yelling. They managed to get a lot done. They've stopped and delayed pipeline projects, and they got City Council to pass a moratorium on new fossil fuel infrastructure in King County. 350 is a pretty great example in my experience of where community and activism meet, and there's something for everyone. Kids can be involved, people who are artistic but don't want to participate in civil disobedience can be involved, and there's really something for everyone's level of comfort. The Extinction Rebellion is one organization that's getting a lot done by civil disobedience. As activism, it's pretty like it's stereotypically pictured, big and brash and disruptive. In April 2019, their acts in London shut down some of the events for Fashion Week, and hundreds of people were arrested, but 11 days after the protests, the UK declared a climate state of emergency. Civil disobedience, when done strategically, can work, but not everyone's comfortable with it, and like I said, that's not the only way to be an activist. The Sunrise Movement is part of a wave of youth who might be too young to vote but are getting their voices heard nonetheless. This is a picture of them last year occupying the Capitol in DC, demanding a Green New Deal and dramatic climate change action. If people too young to vote are leading the environmental justice movement, isn't it our job as adults to get involved as well? And you don't have to do direct civic action, or you can do things in addition to it. If you have money invested in fossil fuels, now's the time to divest it and redirect it towards sustainable energy projects. You can also check to see if your bank is funding fossil fuel infrastructures. Chase, Wells Fargo, Citibank, and Bank of America are just a few of the banks that are providing loans to the fossil fuel industry. You can take your money elsewhere, maybe to a local credit union. When you break up with your bank, make sure to tell them why and share it on social media. The company you work for or university you attend might have their own toxic assets. Ask where their money is invested, and if it's funding fossil fuels, talk to your colleagues about how to make change happen. It's already worked at the University of Washington, and Amazon employees are working right now to get their company to take responsibility for their massive carbon footprint. Getting involved with civic action is really important, and you don't even have to get up off your couch. You can call or write your legislators to ask them to support climate action. You can call often. You can support candidates who support climate justice as a primary part of their campaign. You can sign up with the Sierra Club or 350 Seattle for text alerts about calls to make on any given day. It takes some getting used to, but once you start flexing your legislative muscles, you'll find that it can actually be pretty fun. And finally, talk about climate change. Your peers might not be talking about it either because they're experiencing grief and anxiety of their own, or because they're afraid of talking about it and bumming other people out. It's a human tendency to steer clear of subjects that might make other people uncomfortable. But honestly, if someone isn't feeling at least a little apprehensive about the climate crisis at this point, they're intentionally hiding their head in the sand. And that's not doing them or the planet any good. If we show our community members that the climate crisis is a safe and important subject to talk about, we might be able to inspire them to take action in their own way. Everything I've talked about comes down to these main points. Ecoanxiety is a real emotional challenge that many people are dealing with today. Coping with it in productive, meaningful, community-based ways is good for people and the planet. There are many ways to be involved, and the worst thing a person can do is to sit on the sidelines and think that other people or technology will fix it. Collectively, we hold the power to guide the change that this world needs to literally heal itself. Let's do this together.